The horse's wild eyes reflected pure terror as it reared up against the corral fence, and Grace Monroe knew that most people would have already given up on the animal. But she saw something else entirely in those frightened depths. "Easy now," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of hooves striking dirt. "Nobody is going to hurt you here." It was 1878, and the small ranch outside Dallas, Texas, belonged to her uncle, a gruff man who had taken her in after her parents died of fever 3 years ago. Grace had turned 18 that spring, and while other young women her age were concerning themselves with marriage prospects and social gatherings, she spent her days in the dusty corrals with the horses nobody else wanted. The broken ones. The mean ones. The ones destined for the slaughterhouse because they were too damaged or too wild to be worth the effort. The gelding in front of her now had been beaten badly by his previous owner. She could see the scars along his flanks, the way he flinched at sudden movements. Her uncle had bought him for next to nothing, planning to use him for meat, but Grace had begged for a chance to work with him first. "You are wasting your time," Uncle Bernard had said, shaking his head. "That animal is beyond saving," but Grace did not believe any creature was beyond saving. She just had to find the right approach, the right way to communicate that the world could be gentle if you knew where to look. She held out her hand, palm up, empty of treats or bribes, just offering connection. The horse snorted, tossing his head, but his ears swiveled forward with curiosity. It was a small victory, but Grace had learned to celebrate the small victories. They added up to something bigger if you were patient enough. The sound of hoofbeats approaching made the gelding spook again, and Grace silently cursed whoever was riding up to interrupt her work. She glanced over her shoulder to see a stranger dismounting from a beautiful paint horse, his movements smooth and practiced. He was tall, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar, and he moved with the easy confidence of someone who had spent most of his life in the saddle. "Help you?" Grace called out, trying to keep her voice steady despite her irritation at the interruption. The man approached the corral fence, his eyes not on her but on the terrified horse. "Just passing through, saw you working and got curious." He had a low, warm voice that somehow did not seem to agitate the gelding further. "That is the Morrison horse, is it not? Heard he was a lost cause." "There are no lost causes," Grace said firmly, "just people who give up too quickly." The stranger looked at her then, really looked at her, and Grace felt something shift in the air between them. His eyes were a striking blue-green, the color of the Gulf waters she had seen once as a child, and they held an intelligence that suggested he was actually listening to her words, not just hearing them. "Xavier Ingram," he said, extending his hand over the fence. "I am a horse trainer by trade. Been working ranches between here and San Antonio for the past few years." Grace wiped her dusty hand on her pants before shaking his. His grip was firm but not crushing, respectful. "Grace Monroe, this is my uncle's place." "He is lucky to have you," Xavier said, nodding toward the gelding. "That is fine work you are doing there. Most people would approach that animal with force, try to break his spirit further. You are building trust instead." Something warm bloomed in Grace's chest at his words. Nobody had ever complimented her work before. Most people thought she was foolish or wasting time. Her uncle tolerated her efforts because she did not ask for much and pulled her weight around the ranch, but he had never once told her she was doing good work. "He has been hurt," Grace said simply. "Force is what put those scars on him. Force is not going to heal them." Xavier nodded slowly, his eyes moving between her and the horse with obvious interest. "Your uncle around? I am looking for work, and I heard he might need an extra hand." Grace's heart sank a little. Of course he was just looking for employment. Why else would a skilled horse trainer stop at their small ranch? He is in town. Should be back before sundown. Mind if I wait? I could help with whatever needs doing." She should have said no. They had strict rules about strangers on the property. But something about Xavier Ingram made Grace want him to stay, made her want to hear more of his thoughts on horses and training. "I suppose that would be all right. There is water for your horse by the barn." Xavier tended to his paint with obvious care, running his hands over the animal's legs to check for heat, making sure the water trough was clean before letting the horse drink. Grace watched from the corner of her eye while pretending to focus on the gelding, who had calmed somewhat since the initial disturbance. When Xavier returned, he did not immediately start talking or asking questions. He just leaned against the fence and watched, his presence somehow both noticeable and non-intrusive. Grace found herself moving differently, more aware of her movements, wondering what he saw when he looked at her work. "What is his name?" Xavier asked after a long silence. "I have been calling him Storm, for the color of his coat and his temperament. Fitting." Xavier was quiet for another moment. "How long have you been working with him?" 2 weeks. He let me touch his shoulder yesterday, first time. 2 weeks for one touch." There was no judgment in Xavier's voice, just curiosity. "You have more patience than most people I know." "Patience is free," Grace said, "and he is worth it." "What makes you say that?" Grace turned to look at Xavier fully, surprised by the question. Most people just thought she was soft-hearted or naive. "Because every creature deserves a chance. Because underneath all that fear, there is a good horse who just wants to be safe. He did not ask to be beaten or broken. He did not ask for any of this. The least I can do is give him time to remember that not all humans are cruel." Xavier's expression shifted into something Grace could not quite read. It looked almost like recognition, like she had said something that resonated deep within him. "You have a gift," he said quietly. "I have been training horses since I was 12 years old, worked with some of the best trainers in 3 states, and I can tell you that what you have cannot be taught. You see them. Really see them." Heat crept up Grace's neck. She was not used to praise, especially not from someone who clearly knew what he was talking about. "I just pay attention." "That is exactly what I mean." Xavier gestured toward Storm. "Most people look at that horse and see a problem to be solved. You look at him and see an individual with a story. That is the difference between a good trainer and a great one." Before Grace could respond, Storm took 3 steps toward her, closer than he had ever come voluntarily. She froze, barely breathing, and slowly extended her hand again. The gelding stretched his neck out, nostrils flaring as he took in her scent. Then, miracle of miracles, he let his nose brush against her palm. "There you are," Grace whispered, tears pricking her eyes. "There you are, brave boy." Xavier said nothing, but when Grace glanced at him, she saw admiration written plainly across his face. Not the kind of admiration men usually showed women, based on appearance or demure behavior, but genuine respect for her skill. It made her feel 10 feet tall. Storm allowed her to stroke his nose for several heartbeats before nervousness overtook him and he backed away. But it was progress, real progress, and Grace felt like singing. "That was incredible," Xavier said. 2 weeks and you have him approaching you voluntarily. Most trainers would still be chasing him around with a rope. Most trainers do not understand that you cannot force trust, Grace replied. She left the corral carefully, making sure Storm did not feel trapped by her movements. When she reached the fence, Xavier opened the gate for her, a simple courtesy that somehow felt significant. Up close, she could see he was older than she had first thought, probably 24 or 25, with laugh lines around his eyes that suggested he smiled often. There was a scar along his jaw, faded with time, and his hands bore the calluses and marks of someone who worked hard for a living. "How long have you been training the unwanted horses?" he asked as they walked toward the barn. "Since I came to live here 3 years ago. My uncle would bring home horses bound for slaughter, planning to butcher them for meat and hide. I started asking if I could try working with them first. Most of them came around. Not all, but most." "Where did they go after you trained them?" Grace felt a familiar ache in her chest. "Uncle Bernard sells them, usually to farmers or freight companies, people who need working horses but cannot afford the fancy stock. You do not get to keep any of them. They are not mine to keep." She tried to keep the bitterness out of her voice but was not entirely successful. "I am just grateful for the time I get with them." Xavier stopped walking, turning to face her. "That does not seem fair. You put in all the work, transform these animals, and then they just disappear from your life." "Life is not always fair," Grace said, echoing words her mother had told her long ago. "But at least I know they are going to better situations than they came from. That has to be enough." "Does it, though?" Xavier's question was gentle but probing. "Be enough, I mean." Nobody had ever asked Grace what she wanted, what would be enough for her. She found she did not have an easy answer. "I have not thought much about it. This is just what I do." "You should think about it," Xavier said. "Someone with your talent could do remarkable things if you had the right resources and support." Before Grace could respond, the sound of wagon wheels announced her uncle's return. Bernard Monroe was a heavy-set man in his 50s, weathered by years of hard work and harder living. He had never been cruel to Grace, but he had never been particularly warm either. She was a duty he had accepted when his sister died, one more mouth to feed and back to clothe. "Who is this?" Bernard called out, his eyes narrowing at Xavier. "Xavier Ingram, sir," Xavier said, stepping forward with his hand extended. "I am looking for work. I am an experienced horse trainer and ranch hand. I can do whatever needs doing." Bernard shook his hand perfunctorily, his expression skeptical. "Already got help, got my niece and 2 hired men. Do not need anyone else." Grace saw Xavier's face fall slightly before he schooled his expression back to neutral. Something in her chest twisted. She found herself speaking before she had fully thought through the words. "Uncle Bernard, we could use someone with Xavier's experience. He has been training horses professionally for years. He could help me with Storm and the others." Her uncle turned his skeptical gaze on her. "You seem to be doing fine on your own. Do not need to pay someone to do what you do for free." "I am not asking to replace Grace," Xavier said quickly. "I can see she has real talent, but I could handle the other ranch work, free up more of her time to focus on the horses, and I do not require much in terms of wages. Room and board plus a small salary would suit me fine." Bernard rubbed his jaw, considering. Grace held her breath. She did not understand why it suddenly felt so important that Xavier stay, but it did. Maybe it was just the novelty of having someone who understood her work, who saw value in what she did. Or maybe it was something else, something she was not ready to name. "Can you shoe horses?" Bernard asked. "Yes, sir." "Mend fence?" "Yes, sir." "Help with the cattle when needed, done it plenty of times," Bernard grunted. "I will give you a week trial. You sleep in the bunkhouse with the other hands, take your meals with us. If you work out, we can discuss something more permanent. But if you cause any trouble or do not pull your weight, you are gone. Understood?" "Yes, sir. Thank you, sir." Xavier's relief was palpable. "Grace, show him the bunkhouse and introduce him to the others. Then get washed up for supper." Bernard headed toward the house without another word, his mind already moving on to other concerns. Grace led Xavier to the bunkhouse, a simple structure that housed the 2 other men who worked the ranch. Miguel was an older cowboy who had worked for her uncle for nearly a decade, quiet and steady. Tom was younger, maybe 20, with a quick smile and quicker temper. "We got a new hand," Grace called out as they entered. Miguel looked up from where he was mending a saddle while Tom was stretched out on his bunk reading a dime novel. Xavier Ingram, Xavier introduced himself. Looking forward to working with you all. Miguel nodded in greeting, his weathered face friendly. Miguel Reyes, welcome. Tom sat up, giving Xavier an assessing look. Tom Fletcher, where are you coming from? All over, really. Most recently worked a ranch near San Antonio. Why did you leave? Tom's question had an edge to it, the territorial suspicion of someone worried about competition or change. Ready for something new, Xavier said easily. Been drifting for a while, figured it was time to find a place to settle for more than a season. Grace could feel tension building in the small space. Tom had always been somewhat resentful of her presence on the ranch, though he had never been openly hostile. She suspected he did not like that Bernard sometimes listened to her opinions on the horses, treated her as more than just a burden to be borne. Grace is the one you want to learn from when it comes to the horses, Miguel said, breaking the awkward silence. She has a way with them that is something special. I could see that, Xavier said, his eyes finding Grace's. She was working with Storm when I arrived. It was impressive. Tom snorted. She coddles them, spends weeks doing what a good hard session could accomplish in days. If by accomplish you mean break their spirit completely, Grace said sharply. She and Tom had had this argument before. There is a difference between a broken horse and a trained horse. A working horse does not need spirit, Tom shot back. It needs to follow commands. A horse without spirit is just a machine waiting to fail, Xavier said, his voice calm but firm. The best working horses are the ones that partner with their riders, that trust and respond out of understanding rather than fear. Those horses will work harder, longer, and more reliably than any animal that has just been beaten into submission. Tom's face reddened. I have been working horses since before you showed up, stranger. I am not questioning your experience, Xavier said, just offering a different perspective. Nobody asked for your perspective. Tom, Miguel's voice cut through the building argument. Leave it alone. Man is entitled to his opinion. Tom glared but subsided, returning his attention to his book with obvious irritation. Grace caught Xavier's eye and tilted her head toward the door. He followed her back outside. Sorry about that, she said once they were far enough away that their voices would not carry. Tom can be prickly with new people. He does not like me supporting your methods, Xavier observed. Or maybe he just does not like you getting credit for your work. Grace shrugged, uncomfortable with the insight. She had never wanted to think about the undercurrent of resentment from Tom, had tried to ignore it and focus on her horses. It does not matter what he thinks. It matters if he makes trouble for you. He would not dare. My uncle would let him go. Would he? Xavier's question was gentle but probing. From what I have seen, your uncle tolerates your horse work but does not exactly celebrate it. Grace looked away, toward the corrals where Storm and the other horses were settling in for the evening. The sky was turning gold and pink with sunset, painting everything in warm light. My uncle gave me a home when I had nowhere else to go. I owe him a debt I can never fully repay. If he wants to sell the horses I train, that is his right. What about your rights, your dreams? I am a woman in 1878 Texas, Grace said bluntly. I have the rights my uncle allows me to have until I marry and they transfer to a husband. That is just reality. Seems like a stupid reality. Despite herself, Grace laughed. I cannot argue with that. Xavier stepped closer, his expression serious. For what it is worth, I think you should have more. You have a genuine gift, Grace. People would pay good money for your training services if you were able to set up on your own. That is a nice dream, Grace said softly, but it is just a dream. Women do not own ranches or training businesses. Some do, It is rare, but it happens. Not for girls like me. Girls with no money, no family beyond one uncle, no prospects. You have skill. That should count for something. Grace smiled sadly. You are kind to say so. But we should head in for supper before my uncle comes looking for us. He does not like to be kept waiting. The meal was simple but filling. Beef stew with vegetables from the kitchen garden that Grace tended in her spare time. Bernard sat at the head of the table, with Grace and Xavier on one side and Miguel and Tom on the other. The conversation was minimal, mostly Bernard discussing the work that needed doing in the coming days. "Grace, that Storm horse," Bernard said around a mouthful of bread. "How much longer before he is ready to sell?" Grace's stomach clenched. "He is making progress, but he is not ready yet. Maybe another month if things continue going well." "A month? You have already had him 2 weeks. He was badly abused, uncle. It takes time to undo that kind of damage." Bernard grunted. Time is money, cannot afford to feed an animal indefinitely. "I could start working with him too," Xavier offered. "Not take over from Grace, but supplement her training. Between the two of us, we might be able to move things along faster while still being gentle with him." Grace looked at Xavier in surprise. It was a diplomatic offer, one that addressed her uncle's concern about time while still respecting her methods. And if she was honest with herself, the idea of working closely with Xavier was appealing for reasons that had nothing to do with Storm. "Fine," Bernard said, "but I want him ready to sell within 3 weeks. After that, we cannot justify the expense. 3 weeks instead of 1 month. It was better than nothing." Grace nodded her agreement and saw Xavier give her a small, encouraging smile across the table. After supper, Grace excused herself to check on the horses one final time before bed. It was her nightly ritual, making sure everyone had water, that no one had gotten injured during the day. She was surprised when Xavier followed her out into the gathering darkness. "You do not have to come," she said. "This is just something I do. I know, but I want to learn your routine, understand how you work, if we are going to be training together." Training together. The words sent a little thrill through Grace that she tried to ignore. She was being foolish, reading things into simple professional cooperation. Xavier was clearly a man who took horses seriously, who respected good training. That was all this was. But as they moved through the corrals together, checking each animal, she could not help noticing the way he moved, the gentleness of his hands on the horses, the soft words he murmured to each one. He treated them like individuals, not just livestock, and that alone would have been enough to earn her respect even if everything else about him was unremarkable. "Tell me about the others," Xavier said as they approached a small mare with a scarred face. "What are their stories?" Grace launched into the histories she had pieced together from her uncle's explanations and her own observations. The mare, Daisy, had been in a barn fire and was terrified of enclosed spaces. The old gelding in the corner, Rufus, had been worked nearly to death before her uncle bought him. The young stallion, still unnamed, had been wild caught and roughly handled in the breaking process. Xavier listened to each story with full attention, asking questions, making observations. By the time they finished the rounds, full dark had fallen, and the stars were emerging overhead in their thousands. "You should get some rest," Xavier said. "Tomorrow we start with Storm, and it will be a long day." "What is your story?" The question slipped out before Grace could stop it. "Why are you really here, drifting from place to place?" Xavier was quiet for a long moment, his face half shadowed in the starlight. "Running from the past, I suppose, looking for something I have not quite found yet." "What happened?" "My family had a ranch in East Texas. My father and I did not see eye to eye on much, especially not how to treat horses. When I was 20, we had a fight about his methods. He was using cruel bits, tie-downs, breaking horses' spirits because it was faster, and he said it was more profitable. I told him he was wrong, that there were better ways. He told me if I did not like his methods, I could leave. So you left, so I left. Been working other people's ranches ever since, learning everything I could, saving what money I could. Figured someday I would have enough to start my own place, do things the right way. Grace understood that kind of dream, the distant hope that kept you moving forward even when the present was difficult. "How close are you?" Xavier laughed, but it was not a happy sound. "Not very. Turns out saving money is hard when you are moving from place to place, when you keep running into horses that need help and trainers who need correcting. I have got a tendency to speak my mind when I see animals being mistreated, which means I have been let go from more than one job. You stood up for what was right. Maybe, or maybe I was just stubborn and idealistic." He looked at her directly. "But seeing you work today, seeing what you have accomplished here, it reminded me why I left in the first place, why I have been searching. There are people like you in the world, people who see animals as partners rather than property, and that gives me hope." Grace felt her breath catch. The way Xavier was looking at her, the intensity in his words, it was more than professional respect. It was personal. And the warmth spreading through her chest suggested her own feelings were becoming personal too. "We should both get some rest," she said, her voice slightly unsteady. "Tomorrow will be here before we know it." "Grace," Xavier said as she turned to go. She looked back. "Thank you for speaking up for me with your uncle today. I know you took a risk." "It was not a risk. It was the right thing to do, still. Thank you." Grace nodded and headed toward the house, very aware of Xavier's eyes on her as she walked away. Her heart was beating faster than normal, and she told herself it was just excitement about having a partner in the work she loved. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The next morning dawned clear and warm, promising another hot Texas day. Grace was up before sunrise, as always, and was surprised to find Xavier already in the barn, preparing feed for the horses. "You are up early," she said. "Force of habit. Figured I would make myself useful." They worked in companionable silence, distributing hay and grain to the various corrals. When they reached Storm's pen, the gelding was pressed against the far fence, eyes wide and wary. "How do you want to approach this?" Xavier asked. "I will follow your lead." Grace appreciated that he was not trying to take over, was not assuming his greater experience meant he should be in charge. "Let us start with just being present. No pressure, no expectations. I want him to get used to seeing both of us together, to understand that you are not a threat." They spent the first hour simply sitting on the fence rail, talking quietly to each other and occasionally to Storm. Xavier told her stories about horses he had trained, places he had been, funny incidents and hard lessons learned. Grace found herself sharing things she rarely talked about, her parents' deaths, her grief, her struggle to find purpose in the aftermath of loss. "The horses saved me," she admitted. "After my parents died, I felt so untethered, so lost. But working with these broken animals, helping them heal, it gave me a reason to get up in the morning. It made me feel useful." "You are more than useful," Xavier said quietly. "You are exceptional." Before Grace could respond, Storm took several steps toward them, his ears forward with curiosity. They both froze, letting the horse dictate the pace of interaction. He approached cautiously, snorting and tossing his head, but he kept coming. "Easy, boy," Grace murmured. "We are just talking. Nothing to fear." Storm came close enough that she could have reached out and touched him, but she kept her hands still, letting him investigate on his own terms. The horse sniffed at her boots, her pants, taking in her scent. Then, to her astonishment, he turned his attention to Xavier and did the same thing. "Well, hello there," Xavier said softly. Pleased to make your acquaintance." Storm allowed them both to remain in his space for several minutes before his anxiety got the better of him and he retreated. But it was remarkable progress, a breakthrough that suggested the horse was starting to overcome his fear. "That was incredible," Xavier said once Storm was at a safe distance. "He initiated contact with me, a complete stranger. That speaks to how much trust you have already built with him." "He is a brave horse underneath all that fear," Grace said. "He wants to trust. He just needs time to remember how." They worked with Storm for another 2 hours, gradually asking for more engagement, rewarding every positive response with praise and patience. By mid-morning, Storm was allowing Grace to touch his neck and shoulder while Xavier stood nearby. It was faster progress than she had made in the previous 2 weeks, and Grace realized that having Xavier there was actually helping. His calm presence, his understanding of the process, seemed to reinforce to Storm that humans could be safe. Over the following days, a routine developed. Grace and Xavier would start each morning with Storm, then move on to the other horses that needed training. They worked seamlessly together, developing a wordless communication where a glance or gesture conveyed intentions and strategies. Grace had never had a true partner in her work before, and she found herself cherishing these hours, the focused attention on the animals and the easy conversations that flowed between tasks. But it was more than just good professional partnership. Grace was increasingly aware of Xavier in ways that had nothing to do with horses. The way his face lit up when a training session went well. The sound of his laugh when one of the horses did something amusing. The strength in his arms when he lifted heavy saddles or fence posts. The kindness in his eyes when he looked at her. She tried to tell herself she was being foolish. Xavier would probably move on in a few months, looking for the next opportunity or drifting to the next town. Men like him did not stay in one place long. And even if he did stay, what future could there be for them? She had no dowry, no prospects, nothing to offer except her skill with horses, which hardly seemed like a foundation for marriage. But her heart did not listen to logic. It kept beating faster when Xavier smiled at her, kept hoping he would seek her out after supper for their nightly rounds, kept replaying their conversations in the quiet moments before sleep. 2 weeks after Xavier arrived, Uncle Bernard announced that a potential buyer was coming to look at Storm and several of the other horses Grace had trained. She felt the familiar pain of impending loss, the knowledge that her work was about to be taken away and sold to someone else. "Storm is not ready," she told her uncle. "He has made good progress, but he is not reliable enough yet for an inexperienced handler." "The buyer is not inexperienced," Bernard replied. "He runs a freight company, knows horses well. He specifically wants animals that have been properly trained, not just broken. Word is getting around about the quality of stock we sell." Because of Grace's training, Xavier said, he had become bolder in the past weeks, more willing to speak up. "She is the reason your horses have a good reputation." Bernard gave Xavier a sharp look. "I am aware of my niece's contributions, but this is still my ranch and my decision. The buyer comes tomorrow, the horses will be ready." That evening, Grace sat in Storm's corral long after supper, her heart heavy. The gelding had come to trust her, even looked forward to their sessions together. The idea of selling him to someone else, even an experienced horseman, felt like a betrayal. "He is going to be fine." Xavier's voice came from behind her. He had become adept at finding her in her moments of solitude. "How do you know that?" "Because you have given him the foundation he needs. You have taught him that humans can be gentle, that he can trust. That is not going to disappear just because he goes somewhere else. What if his new owner is not patient? What if they push him too hard and he reverts? Xavier came to sit beside her on the ground, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. That is always the risk. But you cannot keep every horse you save, Grace. You know that. I know. It just never gets easier. They sat in silence for a while, watching Storm graze peacefully in the gathering dusk. Then Xavier said, "What if we bought him?" Grace turned to stare at him. "What?" "What if we pooled our resources, bought Storm from your uncle, kept him ourselves? We do not have enough money, and even if we did, where would we keep him? This is not our ranch." "Not yet," Xavier said, "but maybe someday it could be, or our own place anyway." Grace's heart began to race. "What are you saying?" Xavier turned to face her fully, his expression serious and a little nervous. "I am saying that these past 2 weeks have been the best I have had in years. Working with you, seeing your dedication and skill, it has reminded me what I have been searching for. And it is not just a ranch or a training business. It is a partner, someone who sees horses the way I do, who understands what we could build together." "Xavier." Grace's voice came out as barely a whisper. "I know it is fast. I know we have only known each other 2 weeks. But I also know that some things are right from the beginning, and this feels right. You feel right." He reached out to take her hand, his touch warm and slightly calloused. "I am not saying we have to get married tomorrow or even next month. I am just saying that I want to stay here, work with you, save our money together and build towards something. See where this goes." Grace looked down at their joined hands, her mind spinning. Everything Xavier was describing, it was what she wanted too. A partner who understood her work, respected her skill, someone to share the burdens and the triumphs. And more than that, if she was honest. She wanted Xavier specifically, his kindness and humor and the way he saw her as capable and talented rather than just a burden or an obligation. "I want that too," she said finally. "But my uncle would never allow us to buy Storm. He has a buyer coming tomorrow and he will not want to lose that sale. Then we find another horse. We save our money and when the right opportunity comes, we take it." Xavier squeezed her hand gently. "The point is not Storm specifically. The point is that we start working toward our own future together." "Together," Grace repeated, testing the word. It felt good, felt like possibility and hope. "If that is something you want," Xavier added quickly. "I do not want to presume or push you into anything you are not ready for." In answer, Grace squeezed his hand back. "It is what I want. You are what I want." Xavier's face broke into a wide smile, more open and joyful than she had ever seen him. "You have no idea how happy that makes me." They sat together until full darkness fell, hands entwined, talking about their dreams and plans in low, excited voices. Grace felt like she was standing on the edge of something vast and wonderful, like her life was finally expanding beyond the narrow boundaries it had always known. When they finally stood to head back to their respective sleeping quarters, Xavier pulled her into a gentle embrace. "Thank you for giving me a chance," he murmured against her hair. "I promise I will work every day to deserve your trust." Grace pulled back enough to look up at him. "The same goes for me. I have never had a real partner before. I might not be very good at it." "I think you will be perfect at it," Xavier said, and then he bent his head and kissed her. It was soft and sweet, a question more than a demand, and Grace answered by rising on her toes and kissing him back. Her first kiss, at nearly 19 years old, under a sky full of stars with a man who saw her for who she truly was. It felt like coming home. The next day, the buyer came as promised. He was a weathered man in his 50s named Charles Porter, who ran a freight business hauling goods between Dallas and Fort Worth. He examined Storm and 3 other horses Grace had trained with a practiced eye, asking questions about their temperaments and capabilities. "The gelding has been mistreated in the past," Grace told him honestly. He has come a long way, but he will still need patient handling. He is not a horse for rough treatment or anyone who expects instant obedience. Porter nodded thoughtfully. My lead teamster is a gentle man, good with nervous animals. If you think this horse would work for freight pulling, I am interested. Grace glanced at Xavier, who gave her an encouraging nod. They had discussed this already, agreed that they could not save every horse and that Porter seemed like a decent owner. I think he would be good for that work. He is strong and willing when he feels safe. He just needs consistency and kindness. The sale was completed, along with the 3 other horses. Porter paid fair prices and promised to bring them by if there were any problems with the training. Then he loaded the horses into his trailer wagon and drove away, taking Storm with him. Grace felt the familiar ache of loss, but also something new, a sense that this was not an ending but part of a larger journey. She had helped Storm heal enough to move on to a better life. That was worth celebrating, even if it hurt to say goodbye. You did good work with him, Xavier said quietly, coming to stand beside her as Porter's wagon disappeared down the road. We did good work, Grace corrected. I could not have gotten him ready so quickly without you. Then we make a good team. Yes, Grace agreed, allowing herself to lean against his side. Yes, we do. Bernard was pleased with the sales and the prices paid, pleased enough that he did not object when Xavier asked to speak with him privately that evening. Grace waited anxiously in the kitchen, supposedly preparing the next day's bread but mostly just kneading the dough into oblivion. When Xavier emerged from Bernard's study, he was smiling. He agreed to let me court you properly, he announced. As long as it does not interfere with work and we do nothing inappropriate, Grace laughed, a slightly hysterical sound of relief. What did you tell him? The truth. That I have come to care for you deeply these past weeks, that I believe we could build something good together. That I want to save money and eventually start our own training operation, with both our names on the deed and the business. And he agreed to all that. He said he has seen the way we work together, that it is obvious we have a partnership worth building on. He also said he is not getting any younger and would not mind having someone capable to eventually take over more of the ranch operations. Xavier's smile turned rueful. I think he sees me as free labor more than a future nephew, but I will take what I can get. Grace set down her dough and crossed to embrace him, not caring if someone walked in and saw. This is really happening. We are really going to do this. We are really going to do this, Xavier confirmed, holding her close. It will not be easy or fast, but we will get there. Over the following months, Grace and Xavier fell into a rhythm that was both deeply comfortable and constantly exciting. They worked together on the horses every day, developing techniques and strategies that blended their different experiences and perspectives. Xavier brought formal knowledge and exposure to various training methods, while Grace brought intuition and an almost uncanny ability to read what each horse needed. Word continued to spread about the quality of horses being trained at the Monroe Ranch. Buyers came from as far as San Antonio and Houston, willing to pay premium prices for animals that were genuinely trained rather than just broken. Bernard was making more money than he ever had from the horse operation, and he began to rely more heavily on Grace and Xavier's expertise. As summer turned to fall, Bernard offered Xavier a permanent position with a proper wage. It was not a fortune, but combined with the small amount Grace received for her work, they were able to start saving toward their dream of their own place. They also grew closer as a couple, though they were careful to observe the proprieties expected of courting couples in 1878 Texas. They were never alone together without someone nearby, their physical affection limited to hand-holding and the occasional brief kiss stolen in barn shadows. But they talked for hours every day, learning each other's thoughts and dreams, building the foundation of understanding that would sustain a marriage. Xavier told Grace about his childhood on his family's ranch, the mother who died when he was young, the father who grew hard and bitter. He spoke of his love for horses that began as a small boy, how he would sneak out to the corrals at night to sit with the animals and feel less alone. Grace shared memories of her parents, the warmth and love of her early childhood that made their loss even more painful. She talked about the struggle to find her place in her uncle's household, the loneliness of being neither family nor servant but something in between. The horses had been her salvation, giving her purpose and connection when she felt adrift. "We are alike in that way," Xavier observed one evening as they sat on the porch after supper. "Both found our place with horses when we could not find it with people. But now we have found it with each other too," Grace said, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Now we have found it with each other," Xavier agreed, pressing a kiss to her hair. As Christmas approached, Xavier began acting mysterious, disappearing into town on errands he would not explain. Grace suspected he was planning something special but tried not to ask too many questions. She was proved right on Christmas Eve when he presented her with a carefully wrapped package. Inside was a beautiful leather journal, the cover tooled with images of horses. "For recording your training methods," Xavier explained. "Your observations about each horse, what works and what does not. I thought it might be useful to have everything written down, both for our own reference and maybe someday to share with others who want to learn your techniques." Grace was deeply touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. It was not jewelry or something frivolous, but a practical tool that showed Xavier truly understood her work and valued her expertise. "It is perfect," she said, running her fingers over the embossed leather. "Thank you. There is something else." Xavier pulled a small box from his pocket, and Grace's heart began to race. "I know we have only been courting for a few months. I know traditional wisdom says we should wait longer. But I also know what I want, and what I want is to build a life with you. To be your husband and partner in everything. To work side by side saving horses and building a future together." He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band, not an expensive ring, but clearly something he had saved for carefully. "Grace Monroe, will you marry me?" Grace felt tears spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, yes, absolutely yes." Xavier slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly. Then he pulled her into his arms and kissed her properly, with all the feeling they had been carefully restraining for months. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, he rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "I should have said that first, but I love you more than I knew it was possible to love someone." "I love you too," Grace replied. "I think I have loved you since that first day when you watched me work with Storm and actually understood what I was doing." They went to tell Bernard together, hands clasped tight. Her uncle was not a demonstrative man, but he shook Xavier's hand with genuine warmth and even hugged Grace briefly. "You have chosen well," he told her. "Xavier is a good man and a hard worker. I think you will be happy together." "Thank you, Uncle," Grace said, "for everything, for giving me a home, for letting me work with the horses, for accepting Xavier." "You have more than earned your place here," Bernard said gruffly. "And you have turned this ranch's fortune around with your training. I should be thanking you." They were married in March of 1879 in a simple ceremony at the small church in Dallas. There were no fancy decorations or elaborate celebrations, just their ranch family and a few friends gathered to witness their vows. Grace wore a simple blue dress that had been her mother's, altered to fit. Xavier wore his best shirt and vest, his hair neatly trimmed, his eyes shining with happiness. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier kissed Grace like it was the only thing that mattered in the world, and she kissed him back with equal fervor. They were partners now in every sense, bound by love and shared dreams. Bernard had cleared out a small cabin on the far end of the property for them, a two-room structure that had been used for storage. It was not much, but it was theirs, a space they could make into a home. They spent their wedding night talking and laughing and learning each other in new ways, and Grace felt complete in a way she never had before. Married life suited them both. They continued working together with the horses, but now they could also plan more openly for their future. Bernard had proposed a deal where they could eventually buy a portion of his land, establishing their own training operation while still being part of the larger ranch. It was not exactly what they had originally dreamed of, but it was a good opportunity, one that would give them a foundation to build on. Grace continued documenting her training methods in the journal Xavier had given her, filling pages with observations and techniques. Xavier added his own notes, and together they developed a comprehensive approach that blended patience and understanding with practical skill building. They began to think about eventually offering training services to other ranchers, teaching their methods more widely. But mostly, they were just happy. Happy in their work, happy in their marriage, happy in the quiet moments at the end of long days when they would sit together and watch the sun set over the corrals full of horses they had helped heal. In the fall of 1879, Grace realized she was pregnant. She told Xavier one evening after they finished their rounds, pulling him into the cabin and closing the door before delivering the news. His reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He let out a whoop of joy, picked her up and spun her around, then set her down carefully as if she had suddenly become fragile. "A baby. We are going to have a baby." "We are going to have a baby," Grace confirmed, laughing at his excitement. "Are you happy?" I know we had not specifically planned this yet, but are you happy?" "I am so happy," Grace assured him. "A little scared, maybe, but happy." Xavier pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "We are going to be good parents. We know how to be patient, how to understand without words, how to build trust. All those things we do with horses, we can do with a child too." Grace laughed against his chest. "I am not sure parenting is quite the same as horse training." "No, but the principles are similar. Love, patience, consistency, those are universal." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Grace found the physical changes frustrating as they limited how much she could do with the horses. Xavier took on more of the heavy work, insisting she focus on the quieter aspects of training, and Grace tried not to resent the restrictions too much. Bernard was surprisingly pleased about the baby, even going so far as to say he looked forward to having a young one around again. He began making plans for expanding the cabin, adding a room that could serve as a nursery. In May of 1880, Grace went into labor. It was long and difficult, and there were moments when both she and Xavier were terrified. But with the help of the local midwife and Xavier's steady presence holding her hand, Grace delivered a healthy baby boy just as dawn was breaking. "What should we name him?" Xavier asked, cradling his son with obvious wonder. Grace had been thinking about this for months. "What about James?" "It was my father's name." "James Ingram," Xavier tested the sound of it. "I like it. James Edward, maybe?" "Edward was my mother's father's name." "James Edward Ingram," Grace agreed. "It suits him." The baby was a good sleeper, which meant Grace could return to working with the horses sooner than she had expected. She would bring James with her in a basket, setting him in the shade of the barn while she worked. Xavier would check on them constantly, unable to resist the pull of his new son. They were exhausted and overwhelmed and happier than either had ever been. As James grew from infant to toddler, he showed an early fascination with the horses. He would watch them for hours, giggling when they came close to investigate him. By the time he could walk, he was following Grace and Xavier around the corrals, mimicking their movements and trying to help in his toddler way. "He is going to be a natural," Xavier observed one afternoon when James was 2. The boy was standing at the corral fence, perfectly still, watching Grace work with a nervous mare. "Like his parents," Grace said with a smile, the training operation continued to grow. They were now known throughout North Texas for their humane methods and the quality of their results. Buyers came from as far away as Louisiana and Arkansas, and they had a waiting list of horses that needed their services. In 1882, Bernard made them an offer they had not expected. "I am getting old," he said bluntly. "My health is not what it was. I want to sell you the ranch, or at least the majority of it. Keep a small portion for myself and a cabin to live out my years, but turn over the operations to you too." Grace and Xavier looked at each other in shock. "Uncle, we cannot afford to buy the ranch," Grace said. "Not at fair market value." "I am not asking for market value," Bernard replied. "You two have turned this place into something special. The training operation brings in more than the cattle ever did. You have earned the right to own it. We can work out payments over time, something manageable." It took several days of discussion and negotiation, but they eventually reached an agreement. Bernard would sell them the ranch at a reduced price, with payments stretched over 10 years. It was still a significant financial commitment, but it was achievable, especially with their growing business. In January of 1883, the papers were signed. Grace and Xavier officially became owners of the ranch that had been her home for nearly a decade. They renamed it the Healing Horse Ranch, a name that captured their mission of helping damaged animals find their way back to trust and usefulness. With ownership came the freedom to make changes and expand. They built additional corrals and a larger barn. They hired on more help, including a young man named Samuel, who showed real promise as a trainer and was eager to learn their methods. They began offering classes and demonstrations, teaching other trainers their techniques. Grace was pregnant again, and in the summer of 1883, she delivered a daughter they named Emma Rose. James, now 3, was fascinated by his baby sister and appointed himself her protector. The cabin that had once seemed adequate for 2 was now bursting at the seams, so they made plans to build a proper house. The new house went up in the fall of 1883, a solid 2-story structure with enough rooms for their growing family, and a study where Grace could continue documenting their training methods. It felt impossibly grand to Grace, who had grown up in modest circumstances and spent years in a 2-room cabin. But Xavier insisted they deserved a real home, a place that matched the success they had built together. "We did this," he said as they stood looking at the completed house. "We built this with our own hands and skills and determination." "We did," Grace agreed, still slightly awed by how much their lives had changed in 5 years. The years flowed by in a rhythm of work and family. James grew into a skilled young horseman, showing his parents' gift for understanding and communicating with animals. Emma proved to have a sharp mind for business, helping keep track of the ranch finances and correspondence as she got older. In 1888, Grace and Xavier were invited to give a presentation at a horse trainers conference in San Antonio. It was the first time their methods would be formally presented to a large professional audience, and Grace was nervous about speaking publicly. "You know your material better than anyone," Xavier assured her, "and you have a gift for explaining things clearly. They are going to love you." The presentation went better than Grace had dared hope. The audience, mostly men, was skeptical at first. But as she described her techniques and showed photographs of her successes, they began to listen with real interest. When she finished, the applause was enthusiastic, and several prominent trainers approached her afterward to discuss potentially learning more about her methods. "You were brilliant," Xavier said that evening in their hotel room. "You changed minds today. I could see it happening." Grace felt a deep sense of satisfaction, not just because the presentation had gone well, but because she had been given a platform to share ideas she believed in, to potentially influence how horses were treated across the state and beyond. It was more than she had ever imagined possible as a frightened 18-year-old working with unwanted horses in her uncle's corrals. By the early 1890s, the Healing Horse Ranch was firmly established as one of the premier training operations in Texas. They had expanded to employ 6 full-time trainers and several support staff. Grace and Xavier had published a small book on their methods, which was selling well among serious horsemen. They were regularly consulted by cavalry units, freight companies, and wealthy ranchers who wanted horses trained properly. But success had not changed the essential nature of their work. They still focused on the horses nobody else wanted, the damaged and the difficult. Every horse that came through their corrals received individual attention, careful assessment, and patient training tailored to their specific needs. It was labor-intensive and not always profitable, but it was the work they had committed to, the mission that had brought them together. James was 13 now, a lanky boy on the verge of manhood who could already train horses as well as many adult professionals. Emma, at 10, was managing much of the ranch's paperwork and correspondence, her neat handwriting filling ledgers and letters. Grace and Xavier had been blessed with one more child, a son named Thomas born in 1890, who was still toddling around and getting into everything. Grace was 41 years old, her dark hair streaked with gray, her hands marked by years of hard work. But she felt more alive and purposeful than ever. Every morning she woke beside Xavier, still handsome despite the years and the weather lines on his face, and felt grateful for the life they had built. One evening in 1895, after the children were in bed, and the last of the day's work was complete, Grace and Xavier sat on the porch of their house watching the sun set. It was a ritual they had maintained through all the years and changes, this quiet time together at the day's end. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Grace asked. "When you rode up and saw me working with Storm?" "All the time," Xavier admitted. "I think about how close I came to just riding past, maybe stopping for one night and moving on like I had at so many other places." "What made you stop?" "Honestly, the way you were looking at that horse. There was such focus, such compassion in your face. I had spent years looking for someone who saw horses the way I did, who understood that they were partners, not property. And there you were, this young woman in a dusty corral, treating a damaged gelding like he was the most important thing in the world." Xavier reached for her hand, their fingers intertwining automatically. "I think I fell in love with you right then, though I did not have words for it yet." "I fell in love with you too," Grace said. "When you told me I had a gift, when you actually saw what I was doing instead of just dismissing it as foolishness or wasted effort. Nobody had ever done that before. Best decision I ever made, stopping that day. Everything good in my life came from that choice." Grace squeezed his hand. "We were lucky to find each other." "Luck maybe," Xavier agreed. "But also we were both looking, both ready to recognize something good when we found it. That matters too." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sky turn from gold to purple to star-studded black. From inside the house came the sound of Thomas waking from a nightmare, and Emma's patient voice soothing him back to sleep. The corrals were quiet, all the horses settled for the night. A warm breeze carried the scent of hay and dust and growing things. "I could not have imagined this," Grace said softly. 17 years ago, when you first arrived, if someone had told me this is where we would be, I would not have believed it. A ranch of our own, a family, respect and success. It seemed impossible. What is impossible about it? You have always had incredible talent and dedication. But I was just a girl. A girl with no prospects, no money, no future except whatever marriage might bring or a lifetime of dependency on my uncle's charity. Xavier turned to face her more fully. "You were never just anything. You were extraordinary from the beginning. The world just needed time to recognize it." "The world needed you to recognize it," Grace corrected. "You saw me when no one else did. You gave me confidence and partnership and love. You helped me become who I was meant to be." "We did that for each other," Xavier said. "I was drifting before I found you, had been drifting for years. You gave me a home and a purpose and a reason to build something permanent." Grace leaned over to kiss him, soft and sweet. After 17 years of marriage, the spark between them had not dimmed. If anything, it had grown stronger, deepened by shared experiences and mutual respect. "I love you," she said. "I love the life we have built and the family we have made and the work we do together. Every single day I am grateful." "I love you too," Xavier replied. "More than words can properly express. You are my partner, my best friend, the other half of everything I do." They stayed on the porch until late, talking about their plans for the ranch, about James's future and Emma's sharp mind and Thomas's boundless energy. They talked about horses they had saved and horses they had lost, about victories and failures and lessons learned. They talked about growing old together, about someday handing the ranch over to their children and maybe doing more traveling, visiting training operations in other states, and sharing their knowledge even more widely. But mostly they just enjoyed being together, the easy intimacy of a long and happy marriage, the deep satisfaction of work well done and a life well lived. As the years continued to pass, the Healing Horse Ranch only grew in reputation and influence. James took on increasing responsibility in the training operation, developing his own variations on his parents' methods. Emma, showing no interest in marriage, became the business manager, her sharp mind for numbers and strategy keeping the ranch profitable. Thomas, as he grew, proved to have a gift for working with the most difficult horses, the ones that tested even Grace's patience. Grace and Xavier gradually stepped back from the daily training work, though they remained actively involved in the ranch's operations. They spent more time on education and advocacy, working to change laws and practices around horse treatment throughout Texas. Grace published 2 more books on training methods, and Xavier became a sought-after consultant for military horse breeding and training programs. In 1910, when Grace was 62 and Xavier 67, they finally took that trip they had talked about for years. They traveled to California, visiting training ranches and meeting with other horsemen who had adopted their methods. It was strange to be away from the ranch for so long, but also wonderful to see how far their influence had spread. "We changed things," Xavier said one evening as they stood watching the Pacific Ocean, something neither of them had seen before. "Not just for ourselves, but for thousands of horses." "That matters." "It does," Grace agreed. "But what matters most to me is that we did it together. The work would have been meaningless without you beside me." When they returned home, they found the ranch running smoothly under their children's capable management. James was 30, married with 2 children of his own who were already showing an interest in horses. Emma was 27, contentedly unmarried and running the business with remarkable skill. Thomas was 20, finishing his education but spending every spare moment in the corrals. Bernard had passed away several years earlier at the respectable age of 84, leaving them a letter thanking them for taking care of the land he had loved and for building something even greater than he had imagined. Grace and Xavier settled into a comfortable semi-retirement, still working but at a gentler pace. They spent their mornings in the corrals with horses that needed special attention, their afternoons on correspondence and planning, their evenings with family. They became grandparents several times over and found great joy in teaching their grandchildren the same lessons they had learned from the horses: patience, observation, respect, kindness. On a warm spring evening in 1920, Grace and Xavier sat on their porch as they had so many thousands of times before. Grace was 72 now, Xavier 77, their bodies marked by age and hard work, but their minds still sharp, their love still strong. "You have any regrets?" Grace asked, a question they had never quite voiced before. Xavier thought for a long moment. "I regret the years before I found you, not because of anything specific I did or did not do, but because they were years without you in them. Every moment since I rode up and saw you working with Storm has been infinitely better than what came before." "That is how I feel too," Grace said. "My life truly began that day. Everything before was just preparation." "What do you think happens next?" Xavier asked. "We are getting old, Grace. We need to think about what comes after us." "The ranch will go on," Grace said confidently. "Our children understand what we built and why it matters. They will keep the work going and their children after them. The Healing Horse Ranch will outlast us by generations." "That is a good legacy," Xavier said. "But I meant what happens to us when we are gone." Grace reached for his hand, finding it automatically in the darkness. "I do not know, but whatever comes, we will face it together like we have faced everything else. Together is all that really matters." "Together," Xavier agreed. "Always together." They sat on the porch until the stars came out, hands clasped, hearts full, grateful beyond measure for the life they had shared and the love that had sustained them through 4 decades of partnership. Years continued to flow by like water. Grace and Xavier remained active as long as their bodies would allow, though they moved more slowly and tired more easily. They celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary in 1929 with a huge gathering of family, friends, employees, and horsemen from across the state who had been influenced by their work. James gave a speech about his parents' legacy, about how they had revolutionized horse training through patience and understanding rather than force. Emma presented them with a book she had compiled of testimonials from people whose lives had been changed by the Healing Horse Ranch. Thomas, now a father himself, simply hugged them both and said, "You taught us that gentleness is strength. That lesson shaped everything I am." Grace cried happy tears, overwhelmed by the evidence of how far their influence had spread. Xavier held her close, his own eyes damp, and whispered, "We did good, love. We did really good." In the fall of 1932, Xavier's health began to fail. He had been slowing down for some time, but now there was no denying that his body was giving out. The doctors said his heart was weak, that he should rest and avoid exertion. Xavier laughed and said he would rest when he was dead, but he did start spending more time in a chair on the porch, watching the ranch operations rather than participating in them. Grace hardly left his side. After more than 5 decades together, the thought of being without him was unbearable. They spent their days reminiscing, telling old stories, making sure all the important things had been said. "I have loved you every single day since we met," Xavier told her one afternoon. "Even the hard days, the days we argued or struggled or worried, loving you has been the easiest, most natural thing I have ever done." "I have loved you just as much," Grace said, holding his weathered hand. "You gave me everything. A home, a purpose, a family, a life beyond anything I dreamed possible. How could I not love you? Promise me something," Xavier said. "When I am gone, do not stop working with the horses, do not stop living. You still have so much to offer. Do not talk like that. You are not going anywhere yet." "Grace." His voice was gentle but firm. "We both know my time is short. I need to hear you promise." "I promise," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But I do not know how to be me without you. You will figure it out. You are the strongest person I have ever known." Xavier passed away quietly in his sleep 3 weeks later, Grace beside him as she had been beside him for 53 years. He was 84 years old and had lived a full, purposeful, love-filled life. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched. Grace sat surrounded by her children and grandchildren, numb with grief but also grateful. Grateful for every moment they had shared, every conversation and kiss and quiet evening on the porch. Grateful that he had not suffered long or lost his mind to age. Grateful that their last words to each other had been, "I love you." In the months after Xavier's death, Grace struggled to find her footing. The ranch continued around her, her children handling operations with competence and care, but she felt unmoored. She was 84 years old, exhausted by grief, wondering if she had the strength to continue without her partner. But she had made Xavier a promise, and she had never been one to break her promises. Slowly, she returned to the corrals. Not to do heavy work, but to sit with the horses that needed gentling, to offer her presence and patience. She found that the work still soothed her, still gave her purpose. And in the quiet moments with a frightened horse beginning to trust, she felt Xavier's presence, his approval, his love that transcended death. Grace lived for 6 more years after Xavier passed. She spent them surrounded by family, watching her grandchildren grow and her great-grandchildren arrive. She continued to offer advice on difficult cases, to teach young trainers, to be a living link to the methods and philosophies that had built the Healing Horse Ranch into something remarkable. On a spring morning in 1938, Grace passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 90. Her children found her in bed with a small smile on her face, and they liked to imagine she was reuniting with Xavier, beginning a new adventure together in whatever came after this life. The Healing Horse Ranch continued for generations after Grace and Xavier were gone, their principles and methods passed down through their descendants and the trainers they had taught. The name became legendary in horse training circles, synonymous with patient, humane treatment that transformed damaged animals into trusted partners. But for those who had known them, who had seen Grace and Xavier work together with seamless communication and deep mutual respect, the most remarkable thing about them was not the ranch or the methods or the legacy. It was the love. A love that had begun with a chance meeting and a shared understanding, that had grown through years of partnership and challenge, that had sustained them through everything life brought. A love that proved what they had always believed about horses was true for people too. With patience, respect, and genuine connection, anything was possible. And so the story of Grace Monroe and Xavier Ingram lived on, not just as a tale of successful horse training, but as evidence that true partnership, built on shared values and deep love, could create something that outlasted individual lives. They had started with horses nobody wanted and built an empire of compassion. But more than that, they had found each other, recognized the rare gift of true partnership, and built a life that honored both their individual talents and their united vision. In the end, that was their greatest legacy. Not the ranch or the methods or the influence, though all those mattered. Their greatest legacy was the proof that love, real love based on mutual respect and shared purpose, could transform not just individual lives but the world around them. They had changed how people treated horses throughout Texas and beyond. But first, they had changed each other, had helped each other become the best versions of themselves. And that, more than anything else, was worth remembering and celebrating for generations to come.